There are moments in life when nothing dramatic happens. No shouting, no accidents, no sudden tragedy, yet something inside you breaks forever. For me, that moment came quietly on a Tuesday morning with a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hand and my laptop open on the dining table. I wasn't searching for my son. That's the cruel part. I was browsing the website of Hawthorne University, reading an article about their new academic leadership program. As a professor myself, old habits die hard. I liked keeping up with the academic world, even though retirement was only a year away. Then I saw the photo. A familiar face stared back at me from the screen. Sharp jawline, calm smile, the same eyes I used to see staring back at me from the rearview mirror when I drove him to school. My heart lifted for half a second. "Ethan," I whispered. But then my eyes moved downward, to the name. Ethan Hawthorne Cole. I stared at it, certain I had misread it. I blinked. I leaned closer. I read it again. The name Carter, my name, was gone, replaced, erased, as if it had never existed. My chest tightened, not with anger at first, but confusion. I told myself there had to be a mistake, a typo, some formal name for professional reasons. But then I read the biography. Born into a distinguished family with deep academic roots. Born into a distinguished family? I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I had raised that boy alone, in a 2-bedroom apartment, on a public university salary, with secondhand furniture and used textbooks. Distinguished family? My hands trembled as I scrolled further. Mr. Hawthorne Cole has chosen to align his professional identity with the legacy he now represents. Legacy. That word echoed in my mind like an insult. I closed the laptop slowly, as if moving too fast might make the truth hurt more. I sat there in silence, staring at my reflection in the dark screen. In that moment, I understood something painful. My son hadn't just changed his name, he had rewritten his origin, and I was no longer part of the story. My name is Dr. Samuel Carter, and for most of my life, I believed dignity mattered more than wealth. I taught ethics and political philosophy for 34 years at a public university. No ivy-covered walls, no donors' names carved into buildings, just classrooms filled with students who wanted answers to hard questions. I believed education was sacred. I believed character mattered. And I believed I had raised my son to believe the same. After my wife died in a car accident, I became both father and mother overnight. There was no dramatic vow, no heroic moment, just survival. I learned how to braid hair before school plays. I learned how to cook meals that could stretch for 3 days. I learned how to hide my grief so my son wouldn't feel alone. And I worked. Extra classes, summer sessions, research grants that paid barely enough. I turned down offers from private institutions because they required moving, and Ethan needed stability. Every sacrifice felt worth it when I watched him grow into a thoughtful, intelligent young man. He asked questions most adults avoided. Why do people lie even when the truth is easier? Why does money change people? Is success still success if you hurt someone to get it? I thought I had done something right. When he was accepted into an elite graduate program, I cried, not because I was losing him, but because I thought I had given him wings without breaking his spine. The day he left, I hugged him tightly. "Remember who you are," I said. He smiled and replied, "I'm your son. I'll never forget that." That promise echoed bitterly in my mind now, because somewhere along the way, my son had decided that my name was no longer worth carrying. Ethan Carter wasn't born ambitious. He was born curious. As a child, he used to sit in my lectures when he was sick and couldn't go to school, coloring quietly in the back row. Sometimes he would look up and ask questions that left my students stunned. He didn't want to be rich, he wanted to matter. When his classmates talked about big houses and fast cars, Ethan talked about impact, about making change, about being someone people trusted. Trust, that word used to define him. He once returned a wallet full of cash to a stranger because, as he said, "Dad, it wasn't mine. How could I keep it?" I built my life around that boy, not because I expected gratitude, but because I believed love built something permanent. When his mother died, I promised her silently that I would raise him right, that I would give him values no one could buy or steal. And for a long time, I believed I had succeeded. But values don't disappear overnight. They erode slowly, quietly, through approval, through comfort, through belonging. I didn't know when it started. I only knew that by the time I noticed, my son had already learned how to smile while denying my existence. And that realization hurt more than any betrayal ever could. Distance does not arrive loudly. It doesn't knock on the door or announce itself. It slips in quietly, disguised as busyness, ambition, and change. At first, I told myself nothing was wrong. When Ethan moved into his new world of elite classrooms and polished corridors, it made sense that he would call less. Graduate school was demanding. His future was unfolding. A father should be proud, not needy. That's what I told myself every time the phone stayed silent. The first missed call didn't hurt. The second raised a question. By the fifth, silence had started to feel intentional. Our conversations, when they did happen, became shorter, thinner, like fabric worn too many times. He no longer asked about my classes, my health, or the small details of my life. He spoke instead about networking events, faculty dinners, and people whose names meant nothing to me but everything to him. Then, one evening, he mentioned her. "Dad, I've met someone," he said casually as if announcing the weather. Her name was Victoria Hawthorne. The way he said it was different, careful, measured, almost rehearsed. I congratulated him, of course. I asked the polite questions, where she studied, what she did, what she loved. His answers were vague but glowing. He spoke of her world as if it were something delicate, something that needed protection from scrutiny. "She comes from a very established family," he added after a pause. That sentence lingered in the air. Established. Not kind, not warm, not good. Established. Soon after, the changes became more noticeable. When I suggested visiting him, he hesitated. When I asked if I could meet Victoria, he deflected. "Another time, Dad. Things are complicated right now." Complicated? I had lived through grief, single parenthood, financial struggle, and academic politics. Complicated was a word people used when they didn't want to explain something uncomfortable. Months passed, holidays came and went. I spent Thanksgiving alone for the first time since his childhood, eating reheated soup and watching the news at low volume. I told colleagues he was traveling, that he was busy, that everything was fine. Then came the moment I could no longer ignore. I attended an academic networking event hosted by a private foundation, one of those polite gatherings filled with donors, administrators, and carefully curated conversations. I didn't expect to see Ethan there, but I did. He stood across the room, dressed in a tailored suit, laughing softly beside a young woman whose posture screamed privilege. Her hand rested on his arm possessively, comfortably, as if she had always belonged there. I waited, watched, gathered courage. When I finally approached him, I smiled. "Ethan," I said warmly, "it's good to see you." He froze. For a half-second, the mask slipped. Panic flickered across his face. Then it vanished, replaced with calm, polished indifference. "I'm sorry," he said loud enough for those around us to hear. "You must be mistaken." The woman beside him, Victoria, looked at me with polite curiosity, as one might look at a stranger who had interrupted a private conversation. She didn't believe we'd met. she said coolly. Ethan didn't correct her. In that moment, I understood something devastating. He wasn't pulling away because he was busy. He wasn't distant because he was changing. He was distancing himself from me, from my clothes, my name, my history, from the life that no longer fit the image he was trying to sell. I stepped back without a word, not because I had nothing to say, but because I suddenly realized I had already been dismissed. And as I walked away, the truth settled heavy in my chest. My son hadn't just moved forward. He had decided I belonged behind him. The name Hawthorne carried weight long before I ever heard it spoken aloud. After that evening, curiosity, mixed with a quiet dread, drove me to learn more. Not out of jealousy or bitterness, but out of a father's instinct to understand the world that had so easily absorbed his son. The Hawthornes were not simply wealthy. They were established, the kind of family whose influence moved silently without needing permission. Their name appeared on libraries, research grants, and scholarship funds. It was etched into plaques and whispered in boardrooms. They didn't chase prestige. Prestige adjusted itself around them. Victoria Hawthorne was exactly what one would expect. Educated abroad, fluent in the language of power, perfectly composed, the kind of woman who learned early how to smile without revealing anything real. Her father, Charles Hawthorne, sat on multiple academic advisory boards. He didn't teach, he didn't research, yet his opinions shaped hiring decisions, funding approvals, and institutional futures. Her mother, Eleanor Hawthorne, chaired charity galas that doubled as unofficial interviews. A conversation with her could open doors or quietly close them forever. This was the world Ethan had stepped into, and in that world, names mattered. A Carter was respectable, but small. A Hawthorne was protection. I began to see what my son had seen. With that name came access. With that name came invitations. With that name came silence where scrutiny should have been. I imagined the subtle conversations Ethan must have endured. Your background is admirable, of course, but associations matter at this level. You understand how optics work. No one would have told him directly to erase me. They wouldn't have needed to. The expectation would have hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. And Ethan, intelligent and ambitious, would have understood. Still, understanding did not ease the pain. I had never tried to compete with wealth. I had taught my son that dignity was enough, that character built a stronger legacy than influence ever could. But the Hawthornes offered something I never could: certainty. Their name promised safety in a roofless world. It promised insulation from failure, from consequences, from being ordinary. I realized then that Ethan hadn't fallen in love only with Victoria. He had fallen in love with the world that came with her. A world where doors opened before you knocked, where mistakes were quietly erased, where your past could be edited to suit your future. And slowly, painfully, I accepted a truth no parent wants to face. My son hadn't rejected me out of cruelty. He had done it out of fear. Fear of being small, fear of being excluded, fear that my name, once a source of pride, was now a liability. But what Ethan did not yet understand was this: names built on influence can crumble overnight, and when they do, only character remains. Public spaces have a way of turning private pain into something unbearable. The gala was held in a grand hall filled with soft music, crystal glasses, and carefully controlled laughter. It was one of those events where influence dressed itself as charity and ambition hid behind polite applause. I had attended dozens like it over the years, but that night felt different. I didn't belong there anymore. I just hadn't realized it yet. I noticed Ethan across the room almost immediately. He stood beside Victoria and her parents, his posture straighter than I remembered, his smile refined, practiced. He looked finished, as if he had been polished into someone new. For a moment, I hesitated. A voice inside me whispered, "Don't do this." But he was my son. I walked toward him, past clusters of academics and donors, rehearsing nothing. A father shouldn't need a script. "Ethan," I said, my voice warm, hopeful, "it's good to see you." The air shifted. His smile faded just slightly, not into anger, but calculation. His eyes flicked toward Victoria's parents, then back to me. In that brief silence, I saw the decision form behind his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I think you're confused." Confused. The word landed like a verdict. Victoria turned to me, assessing, curious but distant. "Do you know this man?" she asked Ethan. He didn't look at me when he answered. "No, I don't." That was it. No explanation, no hesitation, no apology. Just a clean, public erasure. I felt something fracture inside me, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Years of late nights, sacrifices, and shared memories were reduced to a single sentence spoken with perfect composure. People around us shifted uncomfortably. Someone laughed nervously. Another guest turned away, already deciding this moment wasn't worth witnessing. I nodded slowly, as if accepting a misunderstanding rather than a betrayal. "I see," I said quietly. Then I stepped back. As I walked away, I realized something important. Ethan hadn't denied me because he hated me. He had denied me because acknowledging me would have cost him something. Status. Approval. Belonging. That night I didn't go home angry. I went home awakened. Because when someone denies their own father in public, it tells you exactly how far they're willing to go to protect the life they've chosen. And it tells you something else, too. They believe the past has no power over the present. They are often wrong. The denial didn't end at the gala. It followed me home. That night, sleep refused to come. My apartment felt unfamiliar, as if something essential had been removed while I was gone. I sat at my desk, the same desk where I had graded Ethan's first essays, and opened my laptop again. I searched his name. This time I knew what I would find. There it was, clean, deliberate, and unmistakable. Ethan Hawthorne Cole. Not a nickname, not a professional alias, a legal identity. His online profiles had been updated. Academic publications listed the new name. Conference programs reflected it. Even his email signature carried the Hawthorne crest discreetly embedded beneath his title. It wasn't temporary. It was intentional. I scrolled through his biography slowly, absorbing every carefully chosen word. His upbringing had been rewritten into something vague and polished. No mention of a public university professor, no reference to a modest childhood, no trace of the life we had shared. I realized then that Ethan hadn't simply stepped into a new world. He had burned the bridge behind him. Changing a name is not just paperwork. It is a declaration. It says, "This is who I want to be seen as," and more painfully, "This is who I no longer want to be associated with." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city outside. I searched my memory for signs I had missed, moments where ambition had outweighed conscience, where silence had replaced honesty. There were a few, small pauses in conversation, carefully edited stories, a discomfort when I spoke about integrity instead of success. I had mistaken growth for distance, reinvention for maturity. What I saw now was erasure. Yet beneath the hurt, something unexpected surfaced. Clarity. Ethan believed a name could protect him, that by adopting the Hawthorne identity, he could outrun his past and reshape himself without consequence. But identity isn't built from letters. It's built from choices. And every choice leaves a trace. As the night stretched on, my pain settled into something quieter and more dangerous than anger. Understanding. The kind that strips illusions away and leaves only truth behind. I closed the laptop. I didn't feel the urge to confront him anymore, because when someone abandons who they were to become someone acceptable, they eventually face a question no title can answer. Who are you when the name no longer shields you? And for the first time since that morning on the university website, I stopped grieving the loss of my son as I knew him. I began watching the man he was becoming. Silence is not empty. It is full of meaning. After the gala, weeks passed without a single word from Ethan. No apology, no explanation, not even an acknowledgement of what had happened. It was as if the moment had been erased the same way my name had been, cleanly and without regret. I didn't reach out either. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood something. Any conversation would happen on his terms, in his world, under his rules. And I was no longer willing to beg for a place in my own son's life. My days returned to routine. Lectures, office hours, quiet dinners alone. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I found myself noticing things I had once ignored, the casual arrogance of donors, the way certain students were protected while others struggled, the subtle bending of rules in the name of reputation. It was a world I had taught about for decades, but now I was seeing it not as theory, but reality. Sometimes I caught myself reaching for my phone, wanting to ask Ethan if he was eating well, if he was sleeping enough. Old habits don't disappear easily. Each time I stopped myself. He had chosen silence. I would respect it. At night, I sat in my study surrounded by books on morality, justice, and power, books I had once assigned to students with confidence. Now their words felt heavier, more personal. I reread passages about compromise, about the cost of belonging, about the slow erosion of self that begins when people trade truth for acceptance. I wondered if Ethan ever felt that weight, or if the comfort of his new life had numbed it completely. There was grief in that silence, but also something else, distance enough to see clearly. Without the distraction of hope, patterns emerged. I noticed how often the Hawthorne name appeared in academic announcements, how frequently certain institutions escaped scrutiny, how quietly reputations were managed. The silence became a teacher. It showed me that what had happened between Ethan and I was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was part of a larger system, one that rewarded compliance and punished inconvenient truth. And in that system, my son had learned quickly. By the end of that month, I accepted a painful reality. The boy I raised was gone, replaced by someone who believed survival required erasure. But silence has a strange way of sharpening resolve. Because when nothing is said, everything becomes visible. And somewhere in that quiet, something inside me shifted, from mourning to watching to waiting. The first crack in the Hawthorne world didn't come with a headline or a scandal. It arrived quietly, the way uncomfortable truths often do, through an email with no name attached. I was in my office late one evening, finishing up lecture notes. The campus was nearly empty, the kind of silence that made even the hum of fluorescent lights sound loud. As I prepared to shut down my computer, a new message appeared in my inbox. Subject: You taught us to question power. I hesitated before opening it. The sender's address was unfamiliar, untraceable. No signature, no greeting, just a short paragraph that immediately tightened something in my chest. Professor Carter, I don't know if you remember me, but I was one of your students. I'm reaching out because something is wrong, and I don't know who else to trust. Attached were several files. I opened the first one slowly. It was an internal academic record, admissions data, grades, scholarship decisions. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but patterns reveal themselves to those trained to see them. Certain students' grades improved dramatically overnight. Others were granted exceptions no one else received, and every anomaly pointed toward a familiar group of names: Hawthorne. I leaned closer to the screen, my academic instincts awakening. Years of teaching critical analysis had trained my mind to separate coincidence from design. This was not random. This was engineered. The email continued. Students talk even when administrators pretend they don't hear. Donations are followed by acceptance letters. Failing dissertations are suddenly revised. Committees sign off without meetings. We're told not to ask questions. I felt a slow chill spread through me, not shock, but recognition. This was the system I had warned students about, the one where influence disguises itself as merit, where ethics are flexible depending on who is watching. I downloaded the files and closed my office door. As I examined the data more carefully, the scope became clearer. This wasn't a single favor or an isolated incident. It was a structure, quiet, efficient, protected by reputation. And then I saw a name that made my breath catch: Ethan. Not accused, not exposed, but present. Listed on committees, copied on approvals, included where decisions were made. In that moment, the story shifted. This wasn't just about an institution anymore. It wasn't even about the Hawthorns. It was about my son and the world he had chosen to protect. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, aware that a door had opened, and once opened, it could never be closed again. The next few days were a blur. I became a shadow in my own life, moving quietly, observing without revealing any trace of what I had discovered. Each morning I walked past the stately Hawthorne mansion and felt a strange mix of anger and disbelief. My son, Ethan, lived there now, comfortable, polished, pretending that our last conversation had never happened, pretending that our bond was irrelevant. I had to be careful. One wrong step and the files I had could be traced back to me. But the questions kept multiplying. How deep did this run? How many favors, bribes, and manipulations had Ethan been swept up in? And more importantly, how much did he know? I spent hours cross-referencing the documents: donors influencing admissions, professors approving dissertations without review, scholarships awarded to students with no merit but always aligned with Hawthorne family interests. Patterns emerged like constellations in a night sky, each one connecting back to the family and by extension to my son. And then came the subtle details: emails marked internal only, notes about meetings that never happened, a clear protocol for bypassing oversight. I realized that this was no longer about a single mistake or moment of weakness. This was a system deliberately built to control the academic world around them, and Ethan, knowingly or not, was right in the center of it. But here's what struck me. Ethan had changed his name, his identity. He had erased himself from our world, not just physically, but socially, morally. And now his choices were tied to a family's ethics were crooked, whose influence was poisonous. I didn't feel rage, not exactly. It was sharper, colder, a kind of quiet resolve. I had tried confrontation before and it had failed. Threats, discussions, reminders of family honor, they meant nothing to him. He had chosen this path. So I made a decision. If Ethan did not face the truth himself, then the truth would find him. But it wouldn't be me who delivered it. I would be the shadow behind the revelation, the invisible hand dismantling the illusion, letting the consequences reach him fully and unmistakably. As I closed my laptop that night, I felt a weight lift and settle at the same time. The pieces were falling into place, and when they finally clicked together, the world Ethan had embraced so eagerly would crumble, and there would be no place left for pretense. It started quietly, an obscure article in an academic journal, barely noticed at first. A scandal, they called it, though nobody fully understood its magnitude yet. I watched from the sidelines as my careful plan began to take shape, feeling a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. The Hawthorne family's carefully curated image, the one my son had so eagerly embraced, was starting to fracture. The first ripple was small. A professor at a minor university, referenced in one of the leaked documents, spoke out anonymously about irregularities in admissions. Headlines began to appear in obscure academic newsletters, then on websites dedicated to investigative reporting. The language was cautious, almost polite, but the accusations were clear: bribery, favoritism, manipulation of scholarship programs. I kept my distance. Ethan still walked the halls of the Hawthorne estate, unaware that the walls around him were weakening. The irony was sharp. I had never wanted to hurt him directly, yet the truth had a way of finding those who refused to acknowledge it, and he had chosen to refuse. As the day passed, the whispers turned into chatter. Graduate students exchanged nervous glances, alumni questioned their degrees, and faculty members started to murmur about audits and investigations. I observed all of it like a scientist studying an experiment, the subjects unaware that the outcome was being carefully guided. And then came the first direct blow to the family's public standing. A well-known education magazine picked up the story, framing it not as speculation, but as a pattern of unethical influence. The Hawthorne name, once synonymous with prestige, was now tinged with doubt. My son's fiancée, whose family had so much sway over him, began to panic. Invitations were rescinded, alliances reconsidered, and social events once guaranteed to impress were now under scrutiny. I could see it in Ethan's posture when he called me that night, hesitant, cautious, almost defensive, but he still did not understand. He spoke as if this were a distant inconvenience, something that could be managed or ignored. He didn't yet realize that the truth moves faster than pride, and once it takes root, it does not wait for explanations. And in that moment, I felt the weight of my silent power. The first crack had appeared, and I knew it was only the beginning. The Hawthorne family's carefully constructed world was unraveling, and my son would soon face the one thing he had tried so hard to avoid: himself. The phone rang in the early morning, and I could hear it vibrating against the polished desk in Ethan's apartment. I didn't answer, because this time the call wasn't for me. It was for him. The first cracks in his world had widened, and now they were beginning to hit him personally. Ethan's fiancée's family, the same people he had once tried so hard to impress, were furious. Emails demanding explanations, urgent calls from lawyers, even private messages from acquaintances warning him to do something before it's too late. The perfect image he had built, the carefully crafted persona that had cost him his own name, was collapsing like a house of cards. He called me later that day, voice tight, almost panicked. "Dad, do you know anything about this? They're saying about scholarships, about bribes. I don't understand. How did this happen?" I could hear the tension in his voice, the confusion, the first taste of accountability. I didn't rush to comfort him. Instead, I listened, letting him confront the reality of his choices. His words revealed more than the scandal ever could: the shame, the fear, and the first real acknowledgement that his identity was entangled with a lie. Across the city, social media was buzzing. Alumni were posting about the irregularities. Professors were being questioned. The Hawthorne name, once untouchable, was now a subject of speculation and ridicule. Invitations were withdrawn, prestigious circles whispered, and Ethan found himself trapped in the very world he had sought to join, only now as a stranger. It was a bitter irony, one that I watched unfold without interference. He had tried to erase me, to distance himself from who he was, but the truth has a stubborn way of finding people who deny it. And now, Ethan faced the most uncomfortable confrontation, not with me, not yet, but with the consequences of his own decisions. I could almost see the reflection of his old self struggling beneath the polished surface, the son I had known before ambition and approval became more important than honesty. For the first time, he realized you can't sell your identity and walk away unscathed. Every call, every message, every whisper of the scandal forced him to look inward. By the end of the day, Ethan was silent, not from relief, not from defeat, but from the dawning understanding that his life, the one he had tried to remake, was now inextricably tied to a truth he had ignored for too long. The confrontation had begun, and there was no turning back. Ethan sat alone in his apartment, the city lights spilling across the floor like shards of a broken dream. The scandal had spread faster than he could process, and for the first time, the carefully constructed world he had built was crumbling around him. No calls, no meetings, no polite excuses could patch the cracks. And yet the worst part wasn't the public humiliation, it was the mirror staring back at him. For the first time, he confronted the choices that had brought him here. Every compromise he had made to fit into a family that wasn't his own, every time he had denied his father's name, every polite lie to maintain appearances, it all felt like chains dragging him under. He realized that in trying to buy approval, he had lost sight of who he truly was. The son who had once been proud of his heritage, who had admired his father's work and integrity, had been buried beneath ambition and the fear of not being enough. He thought of his father, not the man he had resented, the one he had tried to erase, but the man who had always been steadfast, honest, and patient. Every lecture, every conversation, every word of advice he had ignored now echoed in his mind, a relentless reminder that he had taken the wrong path. The irony stung. He had worked so hard to impress a family whose values were now exposed as corrupt, while the man he had rejected had chosen justice over vengeance. The guilt pressed down on him like a weight. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, couldn't escape the relentless questions spinning in his mind. Who am I if not my father's son? What did I sacrifice for this illusion? How do I face the truth? Each thought was sharper than the last, cutting through the pride he had clung to for so long. For the first time, Ethan felt small, not in a world of power and prestige, but in the face of his own conscience. His identity, the very thing he had tried to control, had slipped through his fingers, and the realization was inescapable. No name, no title, no approval from anyone could fill the void he had created by denying who he truly was. As the night deepened, Ethan's eyes rested on a photo of his father on the desk, a silent figure of integrity and strength. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, he began to understand. The confrontation he feared wasn't from the world, or from the scandal, or even from the fiancé's family. The confrontation was with himself, and it was only just beginning. The next morning, Ethan woke with a heaviness he couldn't shake. The city outside was buzzing with its usual rhythm, indifferent to his personal chaos, but inside him something had shifted. The scandal had stripped away the illusions he had built so carefully, leaving him exposed, raw, and searching. For the first time in years, he felt a desperate need, not for approval, not for power, but for guidance. He stared at his phone, hesitant. The name he had avoided calling for months, the name he had tried to erase from his own identity, sat silently on the screen. Every instinct screamed to keep the distance, to maintain the facade that he had carefully constructed. But another, quieter voice whispered a truth he could no longer deny. He had been wrong. His father's principles, once dismissed as rigidity or old-fashioned pride, were the very compass he had ignored in the pursuit of prestige. Finally, with trembling hands, he dialed. The line rang once, twice, and then, "Hello?" His father's voice came through, calm but cautious. Ethan's throat tightened. Words that had seemed simple in his mind now tangled like wires. He tried to speak, to apologize, but the first attempts fell flat. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unsaid emotions, but it was not the cold wall of rejection he had feared. Instead, there was patience, a steady presence that gave him the courage to continue. I made a lot of mistakes," Ethan said finally, voice raw. "I changed my name. I denied who I am, who you are, and I see now. I see what I lost." His father didn't respond immediately. He let the words settle. Then, gently, he said, "It takes courage to admit that, Ethan. That's the first step, but understanding comes next. You have to see why your choices mattered and why they hurt." The conversation was awkward at first, a careful navigation through years of pride, resentment, and misunderstanding. But slowly, walls began to fall. Ethan spoke of the pressures he had felt, the fear of not being enough, and the desire to belong to a family that wasn't his own. His father listened, not with judgment, but with attention, absorbing the confession like a patient teacher preparing to guide a wayward student back to the path. By the end of the call, something had shifted. The distance between them hadn't vanished, and the hurt hadn't disappeared, but a bridge had begun to form. Ethan realized that reconciliation wasn't instant. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging it, facing it honestly, and choosing a better path forward. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps redemption wasn't just an abstract idea, it was possible. And perhaps, with time and courage, he could once again be proud of who he was and of the father he had tried to forget. The day the scandal broke fully in the public eye, Ethan sat in his apartment, staring blankly at the screen. Headlines screamed of corruption, bribery, and deceit, all tied to the family he had once hoped to join. His fiancé's family, the very people whose approval had seemed so vital, were being dismantled piece by piece. And yet, there was no sense of triumph in Ethan's chest, only a hollow emptiness, a hollow realization of what he had almost sacrificed. He remembered his father's quiet words during their call. "Understanding comes next. You have to see why your choices mattered and why they hurt." Now he finally understood. He had tried to chase a fabricated version of success, one built on false identities and shallow alliances, while ignoring the moral compass that had guided him since childhood. The father he had once rejected acted not out of revenge, but from principle, protecting him indirectly, forcing him to confront the truth about the people he had idolized. As the news unfolded, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility. He had been complicit in his silence and ambition in enabling the toxic dynamics of the family he sought to impress. He realized that the only way to move forward was to reclaim his own identity fully, to acknowledge the mistakes he had made, and to face the consequences without excuses. He called his father again. This time his voice was steadier, more resolved. "I understand now. I've been blind, but I want to make things right, not just with myself, but with you. I need your guidance. I need to be myself again." His father's response was simple, almost understated. "Then start there. Face the truth, accept responsibility, and never forget who you are." In that moment, Ethan realized that the scandal, the public humiliation, and even his own missteps were not the end. They were the catalyst. They forced him to confront the reality he had been avoiding, to strip away the illusions he had built, and to finally step into the life he was meant to lead. The path ahead would not be easy. Rebuilding trust, repairing relationships, and regaining self-respect would take time. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, of purpose. He understood that true success wasn't measured by wealth, status, or acceptance. It was measured by integrity, courage, and the willingness to stand for who you truly are. And as he looked at the fading headlines, a quiet determination settled over him. He would face the world, face himself, and reclaim his name, not for anyone else, but for the man he was always meant to be.